You don't belong here, Rachel. You never did. The words cut deep as she stared at the elegant wedding hall, the golden chandeliers reflecting a life she had been cast out of long ago. Rachel, a struggling single mother, had fought hard to give her son Ethan a good life, despite Daniel's betrayal and his family's constant disdain. But tonight, as whispers spread and a hush fell over the crowd, Ethan stepped forward, ready to reveal a truth that would shatter everything. Life was about to turn in the most suspenseful way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I am going to tell you another heartwarming story. So, let's dive into it. Rachel Martinez wiped down the sticky diner counter with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after 8 years at Molly's breakfast and lunch. The familiar scent of pancakes and coffee filled her nostrils as she worked the morning shift, her dark hair pulled back in a sensible ponytail that still managed to catch the attention of regular customers. At 34, she retained the warm smile and bright eyes that had once captivated Daniel, though time and hardship had etched fine lines at their corners. The envelope sat in her apron pocket like a lead weight, the elegant cream-colored invitation to Olivia Bennett's wedding that had arrived 3 days ago. She hadn't wanted to open it, knowing it would only bring more heartache, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. "Mom, did you sign my permission slip for the Science Museum?" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts as he slid onto one of the red vinyl stools, his backpack thudding against the counter. At 12, he was already showing signs of the handsome young man he would become, with his father's strong jawline but Rachel's kind eyes. Unlike Daniel, who had walked out on them when Ethan was just 7, Rachel knew her son possessed a depth of character his father had never managed to develop. She reached across to ruffle his dark hair, cherishing the way he pretended to be annoyed but secretly enjoyed the affection. "It's in your lunch bag, honey," Rachel replied, pouring him a glass of orange juice without needing to be asked. She had mastered the art of anticipating needs, both at work and at home. "Are you sure you want to go to Aunt Olivia's wedding next weekend?" "We don't have to, you know." The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken history and pain. Rachel had spent years trying to shield Ethan from the cold disdain of Daniel's family, especially his mother Margaret and sister Olivia, who had never thought Rachel good enough for their precious Daniel, even before the divorce. Ethan took a long gulp of juice before answering, his expression surprisingly mature for a boy his age. "I want to go," he said with quiet determination that reminded Rachel so much of herself. "Dad will be there, and I haven't seen him in months. Plus, Grandma Margaret promised me a birthday present." He didn't mention that his birthday had been 2 months ago, and Margaret had forgotten again. Some part of Rachel wanted to protect him from inevitable disappointment, but another part admired his resilience and optimism, qualities she hoped he had inherited from her side of the family. Rachel nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in her stomach at the thought of facing Daniel's family, especially now that she knew from neighborhood gossip that Daniel had recently been promoted to partner at his law firm. "All right, but promise me something," she said, leaning closer and lowering her voice even though the morning rush had died down and no other customers sat nearby. "If anyone says anything unkind, or makes you feel uncomfortable, you'll tell me right away so we can leave. Deal?" She held out her pinky finger, a childhood pact system they still maintained despite Ethan's occasional claims that he was getting too old for such things. "Deal," Ethan agreed, linking his pinky with hers before hopping off the stool and shouldering his backpack. "See you at 3:30. Don't forget we need to go shopping for something to wear to the wedding." He waved as he headed for the door, where his friend Jason waited on his bicycle. Rachel watched him go with a mixture of pride and trepidation, wondering not for the first time how she had managed to raise such a thoughtful child amidst the chaos of her broken marriage and financial struggles. The week passed in a blur of double shifts and late-night bargain hunting for appropriate wedding attire. Rachel had splurged on a modest navy blue dress that flattered her figure without drawing too much attention, and a new shirt and tie for Ethan that made him look older than his 12 years. She couldn't afford much for a wedding gift, settling instead on a handmade photo album she had crafted with materials from the dollar store. Olivia would probably sneer at it, but Rachel's grandmother had taught her never to attend a celebration empty-handed, regardless of circumstances. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect May day that seemed designed for weddings and new beginnings. Rachel stood before the bathroom mirror, applying mascara with a steady hand while Ethan fumbled with his tie in the bedroom. "Need help?" she called, knowing the answer before she heard his frustrated sigh. With a small smile, she set down her makeup brush and went to rescue him, gently turning him to face her as she adjusted the dark blue silk against his white shirt collar. "Why do people even wear these things?" Ethan grumbled, though he stood still while Rachel worked. "They're like fancy nooses." His attempt at humor didn't quite mask the nervousness in his voice, and Rachel understood his anxiety. It had been almost a year since they had seen Daniel, and nearly 2 since they had interacted with the wider Bennett family. The last family gathering had ended with Margaret making pointed comments about Rachel's limited career prospects and how unfortunate it was that Ethan had to grow up in a broken home. Rachel finished with the tie and stepped back to admire her handiwork. "You look very handsome," she said sincerely, reaching up to smooth a wayward lock of hair that fell across his forehead. "And regarding the tie, sometimes we do uncomfortable things because tradition expects it. Just like we're attending this wedding even though we'd both probably rather be at home watching superhero movies and eating popcorn." She winked at him, and was rewarded with a genuine smile that eased some of the tension from his young face. The drive to St. Mark's Church took 40 minutes, their aging Honda Civic humming with protest as they navigated the winding roads leading to the affluent neighborhood where Daniel had grown up. Rachel had feared they would arrive embarrassingly early, but the church parking lot was already half full when they pulled in. "Remember our deal?" she murmured to Ethan as they walked toward the imposing stone building, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. He nodded without speaking, his eyes taking in the elaborate floral arrangements flanking the church entrance. Inside, the church was a vision of white roses and pale blue ribbons, with sunshine streaming through stained glass windows to cast colorful patterns across the polished wooden pews. A young woman in a pale blue dress, clearly one of the bridesmaids, approached them with a practiced smile. "Welcome. Are you friends of the bride or groom?" she asked, clipboard in hand. Rachel opened her mouth to explain their complicated connection, but before she could speak, a familiar and unwelcome voice cut through the air like a knife. "Rachel. And little Ethan, my goodness, how you've grown." Margaret Bennett's voice carried a false warmth that didn't reach her calculating eyes as she swept toward them in a lavender dress that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. At 65, Daniel's mother remained a formidable presence, her silver hair arranged in an elegant updo and her posture perfectly erect. She air-kissed Rachel's cheek, leaving behind the cloying scent of expensive perfume. "How nice of you both to come. Daniel mentioned you might attend, though I wasn't entirely sure you'd feel comfortable." Rachel fought to keep her smile in place, acutely aware of Ethan watching this exchange. "We wouldn't miss Olivia's big day," she replied smoothly, though they both knew it was a polite fiction. "Your invitation specifically mentioned family, and regardless of the divorce, Ethan is still Olivia's nephew." She emphasized the last word slightly, a gentle reminder of connections that could not be severed by legal paperwork or family disdain. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Family is so important." She turned to the bridesmaid, who had been watching this interaction with poorly concealed interest. "Jessica, dear, please show Rachel and Ethan to their seats. I believe they have special cards." Something in the way she said special sent a warning prickle down Rachel's spine, but before she could question it, Margaret had already glided away to greet other guests. Jessica led them down the aisle toward the middle section of the church, where most of the extended family would be seated. Rachel felt curious glances from other guests, and heard whispered comments that she pretended not to notice. When they reached a pew about halfway down, Jessica pointed to 2 place cards resting on the polished wood. "Here you are," she said brightly, already turning away to assist other arriving guests. Rachel reached for the elegantly printed cards, expecting to see their names written in the same flowing script that had adorned the invitation. Instead, her stomach dropped as she read the words, "Struggling single mom" on one card, and "Single mom's son" on the other. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the deliberate cruelty of the gesture. She quickly moved to hide the cards before Ethan could see them, but she was too late. "Mom!" Ethan's voice was quiet but tight with emotion as he stared at the offensive cards. Around them, a few nearby guests had noticed the commotion, and Rachel could hear murmured conversations and a few uncomfortable chuckles. Heat rushed to her cheeks as humiliation threatened to overwhelm her. She tried to think of something to say, some way to shield Ethan from this calculated insult, but her mind had gone blank with shock and embarrassment. A heavy hand landed on Rachel's shoulder, and she turned to find Daniel standing behind them, looking uncomfortable but not particularly surprised. At 40, her ex-husband remained handsome in a conventional way, his dark hair now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, his tailored suit emphasizing his athletic build. Rachel, Ethan, he greeted them with forced casualness, as if they hadn't just been publicly humiliated. I see Mother has been creative with the seating arrangements. Perhaps it would be better if you sat at the back. Rachel stared at him, the man she had once loved enough to marry, to build a life with, to have a child with. She searched his face for any trace of the kind, passionate law student she had fallen for 15 years ago, but found only a stranger looking back at her with faint embarrassment and obvious impatience. You knew about this, she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Beside her, Ethan stood rigid, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. Daniel had the grace to look briefly ashamed before his expression hardened. Mother has her ways of doing things, he said dismissively. It's Olivia's big day, and she's already stressed enough without adding drama. Let's not make a scene, all right? For Ethan's sake. He glanced down at their son with a stiff smile that didn't reach his eyes, then looked past them as someone called his name. I need to go, best man duties. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. With that, he walked away, stopping to chat with other guests as if nothing unusual had happened. Rachel felt dizzy with anger and humiliation, but one look at Ethan's devastated face centered her. We're leaving, she decided, taking his hand and turning toward the exit. But Ethan surprised her by standing his ground, his young face set in lines of determination that made him look far older than 12. No, Mom, he said firmly. If we leave, they win. We're going to stay, and we're going to hold our heads high. His words, so adult and so brave, brought unexpected tears to Rachel's eyes. Are you sure? She asked, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. When he nodded, she squeezed his hand and made a quick decision. Picking up the offensive place cards, she discreetly tore them into tiny pieces and tucked the fragments into her purse. Then she led Ethan to seats at the end of a pew near the back of the church, where they could make a quick exit if necessary. As they settled in, Rachel noticed Margaret watching them from across the church, disappointment evident in her pinched expression. Clearly, she had expected, perhaps even hoped, that they would create a scene or leave in humiliation. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and elegance that money could buy. Olivia, resplendent in a designer gown with a cathedral-length veil, walked down the aisle on her father's arm to meet her groom, Nathan Chambers, a successful investment banker with a kind smile and adoring eyes. Rachel watched the traditional exchange of vows with a strange detachment, remembering her own modest wedding to Daniel in a small church with only 50 guests and homemade centerpieces that Olivia had openly mocked. When the ceremony concluded, guests were directed to the Bennett family estate for the reception. Rachel considered skipping this part, but Ethan insisted they follow through. I'm hungry, and they're supposed to have a chocolate fountain, he said with a hint of his usual humor, though his eyes remained shadowed. Rachel marveled at his resilience even as she worried about what other humiliations might await them at the reception. The Bennett estate sprawled across 5 manicured acres, the colonial-style mansion providing an impressive backdrop for the white reception tent erected on the vast lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from the tent ceiling, casting a warm glow over dozens of round tables draped in pale blue linens and scented with towering arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas. A string quartet played softly as guests mingled and waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Rachel and Ethan stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure where to go in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Most of the guests appeared to be friends of the Bennett family or colleagues of Nathan, all dressed in expensive finery that made Rachel feel increasingly self-conscious about her department store dress. Just as she was considering suggesting they find their seats for dinner, Margaret materialized before them again, this time accompanied by a young woman in the catering staff uniform. Rachel, dear, Margaret began with that same false sweetness, I was just telling Sophia here that you have extensive experience in food service. With one of our servers calling in sick at the last minute, I thought perhaps you might be willing to help out? We'd compensate you, of course. The suggestion was delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the implication clear. Rachel was considered staff, not family, despite the invitation. Before Rachel could formulate a response that wouldn't involve language inappropriate for her son's ears, Ethan stepped forward. My mom is a guest at this wedding, he said clearly, his young voice carrying enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. She was invited as family, not as serving staff. And she already works 60 hours a week to support us since my dad decided his legal obligation ends with the minimum child support required by law. Margaret's face flushed an ugly red as heads turned in their direction. Well, I never, she sputtered, looking around as if expecting support from the onlookers. Young man, you should learn to speak respectfully to your elders. Your mother clearly hasn't taught you proper manners. She drew herself up to her full height, looking down her nose at Ethan with undisguised disdain. Rachel placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder, ready to intervene, but her son wasn't finished. Respect is earned, Grandma Margaret, he replied with a calmness that belied his years. And you haven't earned it by treating my mom like she's beneath you, or by making those place cards to humiliate us in church. Did you think that was funny? Did you and Aunt Olivia laugh about it while you were planning this perfect wedding? A hushed silence had fallen over this section of the tent, guests watching the confrontation with varying degrees of discomfort and fascination. Margaret looked around nervously, clearly realizing she was losing control of the situation. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, she said stiffly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on the bride. She turned to leave, but Ethan's next words stopped her cold. You might want to check if she's with my dad, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried in the tense silence. They spend a lot of time together when they think no one is watching. I saw them kissing in our apartment building when Dad came to drop off my birthday present last month. They didn't see me, but I saw them. The color drained from Margaret's face as Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. And I recorded their conversation when they were in Dad's car outside our building 3 weeks ago. They didn't know I was walking by. Rachel stared at her son in shock, trying to process what he was saying. Ethan, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But Ethan's attention was focused entirely on Margaret, whose expression had shifted from outrage to something approaching fear. Without answering his mother, Ethan tapped his phone screen and held it up. Daniel's voice emerged clearly from the device. Olivia, you need to calm down. Nathan doesn't suspect anything, and he never will unless you keep acting so nervous around him. The recording was crystal clear, Daniel's voice unmistakable. A woman's voice, clearly Olivia's, responded with a hysterical edge. How can I be calm? I'm marrying Nathan in 3 weeks, and I'm carrying your baby. This wasn't supposed to happen, Daniel. We were just having fun. A collective gasp rippled through the growing crowd of listeners. Margaret swayed slightly, reaching out to steady herself against a nearby chair. Rachel felt as though the ground had dropped out from under her feet, unable to reconcile what she was hearing with reality. Daniel and Olivia, his own sister. Not by blood, she reminded herself numbly. Olivia had been adopted as an infant before Daniel was born, but they had been raised as siblings, had called the same people mother and father. The recording continued mercilessly, Daniel's voice growing agitated. No one needs to know the baby isn't Nathan's. He wants kids. He'll be thrilled when you tell him you're pregnant. We'll just move up the timeline a bit. Olivia's tearful voice cut through the stunned silence of the tent. But what if the baby looks like you? Nathan will know. Your son looks exactly like you, Daniel. Everyone says so. A harsh laugh from Daniel. No one will notice or care, and if they do, we'll deal with it then. You're overthinking this, Liv. Just get through the wedding, tell Nathan about the pregnancy afterward, and everything will work out. It always does for us, doesn't it? We're Bennetts. The recording ended, leaving a silence so complete that the distant sounds of birds singing seemed unnaturally loud. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, Daniel appeared at the edge of the crowd, Olivia and her new husband Nathan close behind him. What's going on here? Daniel demanded, taking in the scene with confusion that quickly turned to alarm when he spotted Ethan holding his phone. What are you doing, Ethan? Telling the truth, Ethan replied simply, his young face solemn but determined. Something this family doesn't seem very good at. He glanced at Nathan, who stood frozen beside Olivia, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. I'm sorry, Mr. Chambers. You seem nice. You don't deserve this. Nathan turned slowly to face his bride of less than 2 hours, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. Olivia? What is he talking about? What truth? His handsome face was ashen, his hands visibly trembling as he waited for an answer that everyone present already knew would destroy him. Olivia, resplendent in her wedding gown, seemed to shrink before their eyes, her perfectly made-up face crumpling as tears began to fall. "Nathan, I can explain," she began weakly, reaching for his arm, but he stepped back as if her touch might burn him. Behind her, Daniel stood immobile, his expression unreadable except for the muscle twitching in his jaw, a tell Rachel recognized from their marriage, a sign that he was frantically calculating his next move. "Is it true?" Nathan persisted, his voice gaining strength fueled by anger and betrayal. "Are you pregnant with his child? With your brother's child?" The last word emerged as a disgusted hiss that made Olivia flinch. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then simply nodded once, unable to meet his eyes. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Nathan removing his wedding ring and placing it deliberately on a nearby table. "The marriage is over," he said with quiet dignity that somehow made the moment even more devastating. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours tomorrow to begin annulment proceedings. I suggest you do not attempt to contact me or my family." With a final glance of contempt at Daniel, who still hadn't spoken a word, Nathan walked steadily through the crowd and out of the tent, followed quickly by several men who appeared to be his friends or relatives. Chaos erupted as guests began talking all at once, some leaving hurriedly, others gathering in small groups to dissect what they had witnessed. Margaret seemed to have aged a decade in the span of minutes, her face grey and drawn as she collapsed into the nearest chair. Olivia stood motionless in her ruined joy, tears streaming unchecked down her face while Daniel finally moved to her side, speaking urgently in her ear. Rachel felt a small hand slip into hers and looked down to find Ethan watching her with uncertainty. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly. "I know I should have told you, but I wasn't sure you'd believe me, and I didn't want to hurt you more." His maturity and concern for her welfare despite everything made Rachel's heart swell with love and pride. "You have nothing to apologize for," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "You stood up for what was right, and for us. I'm proud of you, Ethan, so proud." And she was, despite the shock and pain of the revelations. Her son had faced cruelty with courage and truth, refusing to be diminished by those who sought to humiliate them. Rachel looked around at the disintegrating celebration, at the remnants of what was supposed to be a perfect day highlighting a perfect family. There was no satisfaction in witnessing the collapse, only a profound sadness for the innocent parties hurt by the deception. Nathan, who had married a woman in love with another man, the unborn child who would be born into such complicated circumstances, even Margaret and William Bennett, who now faced a family scandal that would not easily be contained. "Let's go home," Rachel suggested gently, and Ethan nodded, clearly relieved. They walked together toward the exit, heads held high, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them. Just before they reached the tent opening, Rachel heard her name called and turned to find Daniel approaching, his handsome face twisted with anger and something that might have been fear. "You put him up to this, didn't you?" he accused, gesturing toward Ethan but addressing Rachel. "You couldn't stand to see Olivia happy, so you orchestrated this whole scene. You've always been jealous of my family." His words were desperate, an attempt to rewrite the narrative that was already forming among the remaining guests. Rachel looked at the man she had once loved, the father of her child, and felt nothing but pity. "No, Daniel," she said quietly, "this is entirely of your own making. You and Olivia chose to betray not only your spouses but your entire family. And for what? Because you've both always believed you could take whatever you wanted without consequences." She shook her head sadly. "But there are always consequences, Daniel, always." She turned to leave again, but Daniel grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Don't you walk away from me," he hissed, his facade of control crumbling. "You've ruined everything, you and that brat." He never finished the sentence because Ethan, small but fierce, stepped between them. "Let go of my mom," Ethan demanded, his young voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "Now." To Rachel's surprise, Daniel released her immediately, something in Ethan's determined stance perhaps reminding him of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, even in his anger. They left without further incident, walking through the manicured gardens to the parking lot where their modest car waited. As Rachel slid behind the wheel, she felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. The humiliation of the place cards, the years of condescension and barely veiled insults from the Bennett family, none of it mattered anymore. She and Ethan had faced the worst they could dish out and had emerged with their dignity intact. The aftermath of Olivia's disastrous wedding reverberated through their lives in unexpected ways. Daniel, facing professional censure at his law firm for the scandal, moved across the country to start fresh, effectively removing himself from Ethan's life except for occasional phone calls. Olivia's pregnancy became public knowledge, leading to her own relocation to a Bennett family property in Europe. Margaret, humbled by the public disgrace, stopped her campaign of harassment against Rachel, though they maintained a careful distance from each other. For Rachel, the most significant changes came from within. The experience at the wedding had awakened something dormant inside her, a fierce determination to create a better life for herself and Ethan, one that wasn't defined by Daniel's absence or the Bennett family's disdain. She applied for a management position at the diner and was awarded it based on her years of reliable service. The modest increase in salary and more consistent hours allowed her to enroll in evening classes at the community college, pursuing the education that had been interrupted when she became pregnant with Ethan. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, Rachel sat at their small kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and a laptop, working on a paper for her business management course. Ethan entered quietly, placing a mug of hot chocolate beside her before sitting down with his own homework. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scratching of pencils and occasional tapping of keyboard keys. "Mom!" Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. "Are you happy now?" The question was simple but profound, forcing Rachel to consider her life in its entirety rather than just the daily challenges she faced. She looked at her son, this wonderful, perceptive child who had stood up for her when no one else would, and felt a surge of gratitude and love so powerful it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Yes," she answered truthfully, reaching across the table to cover his hand with her own. "I'm happy, Ethan. We have each other, we have our health, and we have possibilities ahead of us that I couldn't even imagine a year ago." She smiled at him, seeing not just the boy he was but the man he was becoming, strong, compassionate, principled in ways his father had never been. "Are you happy?" Ethan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yeah," he said finally, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I am. It's like, before, there was always this shadow hanging over us. Dad's family, their opinions, the way they made us feel like we weren't good enough. But now," he shrugged one shoulder, "now it's just us, making our own way, and that feels better, cleaner, somehow." Rachel nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They had been freed not just from the Bennett family's interference but from the persistent feeling that they needed to prove themselves worthy of inclusion. That freedom had opened doors within themselves, confidence, ambition, hope for a future limited only by their own determination rather than others' judgments. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Rachel stood at the window of their small apartment, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about the path that had led her here, the naive young woman who had fallen in love with Daniel Bennett, the devastated divorcee struggling to raise a child alone, the humiliated ex-wife standing in a church reading those cruel place cards. Each version of herself had contributed to the woman she was now becoming, stronger, wiser, increasingly comfortable in her own skin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, an exam to study for, bills to juggle, the constant balancing act of work and school and motherhood. But tonight, in this quiet moment of reflection, Rachel embraced the peace she had found within herself. It hadn't come from external validation or revenge against those who had hurt her. It had come from finally recognizing her own worth and the courage to pursue the life she deserved. With Ethan beside her and hope in her heart, Rachel Martinez turned away from the window and toward her future, one that was finally, wonderfully, entirely her own. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.